Hi, my name is Paul. Welcome to part 2 of our 6-part series on internationalization in Next.js. We started this series last week by building a very simple create next app application and taking that to the point where we had our content for a very simple layout internationalized, showing content in English and Dutch. In fact, I'll show it to you here. Okay, so if we look at what we've got the catalog header, a couple of products, each one has a title and a description, an add to cart button, we have a footer, and most importantly, we have a locale selector, which in this case is letting us switch between English and Dutch. So we left off the end of last video by highlighting a couple of problems with this application. Number one, we pass our dictionary around as props to every component that wants to show any internationalized content. And we also, of course, have to pass around the lang or locale to any component that wants to make use of that. So what that means is that this style of building a Next.js application is mostly well suited to very simple applications that you don't think are necessarily going to scale either in terms of their size or their complexity. Because if you do need to end up having lots of nested components, say your component structure goes 10, 20 levels deep, which can definitely happen on large applications, it just becomes kind of tedious. It's doable, but it's a bit of a management overhead, maintenance, nightmare. And it's just not the best way to do things. So in this video, we're going to work through that in a couple different ways, and we'll show you how you address that. The second major problem is that if we look again here at the application, you'll see that we have two locales, which is great if that's all you're trying to serve. But what if you want to add a third language, or maybe you have 10 or 20 languages that you want to serve your application in? Well, this sort of a layout is just not going to work, right? You can't show all those locales across the header and have it look nice anyway. So we're going to need some sort of interactive component. And so that means we are going to have to start introducing some use client components. So far, everything here being on Next.js 14 and the app router is server-side components. And so we're going to look at the various approaches to address this. Now, of course, I'm sure you've guessed by now, what I'm referring to is using a third-party internationalization library. We've selected for this video 3 of the most popular, and we want to walk through what it's like to implement those libraries in this sort of an application so that you can get a more hands-on feel for what it's like to actually use these. There are definitely pros and cons to each one. At the end of the video, we'll make a recommendation as to what we would use based on what we're seeing so far as these packages currently stand right now in late February 2024. And from there, we will probably use that package for the rest of this series. So you're definitely going to want to stick around, see how each of these packages measure up against each other, and then we will continue moving onward with internationalization. That said, let's jump right in. Okay, so we've put together a new repo for the work that we're going to do here in this video, and you'll see that there are 4 applications inside of this folder here. One, the JSON only one, is the one that we built last week, and we'll take a quick look at that in just a moment. Then we started off with a copy of that application for each of the 3 libraries that we wanted to implement. We did the implementation. We'll walk through that here in this video, but I just want to give you a brief look at where things left off. So we set up our middleware like so. If you recall, we discussed the option to either have a default locale for your application or not. We showed the middleware that you could use for both versions. This here is the version where you do have a default locale for your application. We set up those locales in a locale file. We made an i18n config, and we go into a bit of detail on these 2 files in that video. We'll have more upcoming in future videos. And then we also did a bit of minor configuration for the TS config, and then jumping into the structure of the application itself. If we look at layout here, you'll see that we do generate static params for the 2 languages that we're interested in. And then we get our dictionary for the lang that we're currently viewing. And we're going to pass the lang property to the HTML tag to tell the browser which language we're viewing content in. And we do a bit of CSS. We have a main layout, which is going to receive our dictionary and lang as well. And then now notice we can't really pass those values to the children, that being the page and anything inside of a page. So we actually have to jump over to the page, import that dictionary again, and then we can pass that along again as props to product, which then passes those values along as props to the button, and so on and so forth. Now, that's the limit of the prop drilling we have to do in this app. But of course, you can imagine for a more complex application, repeat and repeat ad nauseum. So not great. Okay, let's dive in with the first of these three libraries here. We're going to check out Next International. Now, as far as we can tell, this one is the least popular of the three that we're going to be taking a look at, but it's really very nice. And so I wanted to make sure you had a chance to take a look at it. We'll start in middleware again. And you can see that we are importing our defaults for our default locale and our locales that we set up previously. And then we have a couple different examples here, again, straight out of the docs, of the ways that you can create your I-18 middleware. And here, let's get rid of this. Okay, so one is going to be showing the default locale, one is going to be not showing the default locale, and this one we don't want to show the default locale, so we can actually ditch all of this. And it's a pretty tidy little middleware. Okay. No changes in tsconfig, so we will jump straight into the locale. I'll pop all this open so we can click around pretty easy, and we will look at all of this. Okay, so the next step to wiring all of this up is to understand that this application is going to have a slightly different configuration for if you're showing translations on the server rendering of the content or on the client rendering of the content. So we'll check out the server here. This looks pretty similar to our dictionaries lib file that we created in the last video, but we get a couple of these methods back that we're going to go ahead and export. We are just going to import our translations, which look very similar to what we had last week, and we're going to make those available as exports. And then we'll check out the client. Now here, this is again pretty similar, but you notice that we get a couple of hooks, and so that's already looking pretty client-ish. So, and then locales looks like this, very similar to what it did last week. And then we are going to move on to layout here. And this file looks, again, very similar to what we had last week, but it's already more simple. Note that we are not importing our dictionary, and even more importantly, we're not passing along our dictionary. Of course, the dictionary in our application right now is very small. It can become considerably larger as the application grows, and so nice to not have to pass that around. Okay, so then we're just passing locale to the main layout. And the reason here is that the main layout is going to import what we're calling the sub layout. And this really is just a wrapper to import the client stuff that we were looking at earlier. So we have access to our hooks and whatnot. So we take this provider and we're going to wrap it, in this case, just around the header, because as you can probably imagine, that's where our locale selector is going to be. So that's pretty client-ish. And so that needs to wrap this so that the header then has available to it, the ability to do use client and actually work, and make use of these hooks that are made available via the client. And so here's kind of where the business happens in terms of changing locales. We have a client select component that we have created in the components directory here. We'll walk through that. It's a bunch of kind of boilerplate, so we won't go into it in too much depth, but we're seeing. So then we have these hooks available, use change locale, and then we have the current locale, and then we have, if you've done any internationalization with other libraries previously, you will have seen something like this quite a bit. So when we actually select a new locale, we're of course going to call our change locale function. Do a little bit of basic typing here, very basic. And then we have the select trigger, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, we can take a look at these. So just kind of a big component. Obviously, yeah, this can be chopped up, but just for this demo, we decided to keep it simple. So that is how we display the current locale and change locales, which then is going to lead us to our page. Now, notice page is not getting any props, neither dict nor locale, because it doesn't need it. Because these functions are all going to be instantiated knowing what the current locale is. So that's great. We have to pass very few props to these. And then there is this get scoped I18N function available, which basically means give us a subset of our dictionary and just make available the values that are inside of that little piece. And so we aren't always working with the entire dictionary. And then again, product is much more simple now. We're just passing the ID. You know, if you had fetched some products from your server, you can imagine that this would be an array of products, and this would look, you know, very standard and compared to what you're used to if you've done stuff like this before. And so we're just going to pass our product. We're just going to open our product rather. And this component also is looking quite a bit more simple. Here, we are going to get even more tightly scoped information. We're going to say, just give me the product information on this one. Now, this may or may not match exactly your pattern that you're going to have in your application, but the point is we're able to nest down to a very low level on the translations that we're interested in getting. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it'd be nice to get rid of those props that we're passing to the button too, which of course you can see is done here. We just call get i18n here, and we're just going to get products.cart. Of course, we could have done the scoped function, but here's another way that you can manage that. Alrighty, so that is looking pretty cool. It does what we want. We don't have a whole lot of extra boilerplate. Things are looking pretty good. You know, if we look at the footer now, which is not client, we're just going to call get scoped i18n. And then boom, we pass it along. And let's take a look, of course, at the application. We have a nice drop down. We can switch from English to Dutch. And of course, if we wanted to have 30 locales, boom, we just put them right there. It doesn't change our layout at all. Pretty cool. So let's now keep this moving and we will look at our next library. By the way, just one final thing I forgot to do as I was recording this segment is just to take a look at the doc site for Next International. Let's jump over here. So pulling this up, we see that the best result appears to be, at least what's currently ranking the best, appears to be the NPM package page, which it's not wonderful. I think this is actually maybe improved over the course of our looking at these libraries. But anyway, the point is that you want to go to the home page here. By the way, this application, or this package rather, it definitely needs more love because the implementation's pretty smooth with this, and only 12,000 people a week are using this, which is quite small in comparison to the rest of the libraries. So we look at the Next International Vercel app docs here, and this is a bit of feedback for the creator of this package if he happens to see this video. I would work on optimizing this a bit more. There's a number of ways that you can get to this docs site, but if you don't see it first on Google, you kind of got to click through a bunch. And by the time I have to do that, I may not have the ambition to go through all of this. And I think even I first went to the GitHub page, and then I went to the NPM page maybe, and then to the docs, and then I got to click through here, and then I go to documentation. This is probably holding things back a little bit, so if that's possible to optimize, probably worth doing. Because the features are amazing. I didn't want to leave this library without actually going through all of this. So it's 100% type safe. It'll type safe your library itself, which is great. It's a very small library. There's no dependencies. Lazy loaded, no Webpack configuration, no CLI, no code generation, just pure TypeScript. All very good stuff. It's server and client static rendering. That's great, and this one does a pretty good job. So we'll come back to this point at the end of the video, but you can use it with the app or the pages router. I don't know really what more you could ask for, but that said, we will push forward. Let's go on to the next library now. Okay, now let's talk about our second library. This is going to be Next-I18 Next. This is kind of like the Next.js flavor of react.I18 Next, both very popular libraries, at least up until the app router. And so I want to start the description here of this library with that caveat, and it doesn't necessarily go uphill from here. So let's take a look. All right, so I am at the GitHub repo for Next-I18 Next, and they pretty much start out by just more or less throwing their hands up in the air. They say, if you're using Next 13.14 with the app directory, there's no need for Next-I18 Next. You can directly use I18 Next and React-I18 Next, like described in this blog post. So we'll jump to this one here. Kind of already a red flag, but maybe there's something good going on here. So there's a bunch of boilerplate here, as is kind of the standard in the React.I18 Next ecosystem. Lots of imports, lots of use this and that. Okay, nothing terrible, nothing necessarily deal breaker here, but it does kind of give you an idea of why I don't necessarily love Next.I18 Next. But what I want to point out here, remember, we're trying to accomplish both server and client static rendering. So let's keep on going here. We got some more for the client side. Man, it's a lot of boilerplate. Okay, here is the critical piece. We need to create two versions of the footer component. Man, it's kind of a deal breaker. Now, it ends up not being terrible, but this is how they end up accomplishing the server client thing. For me, that's too much. So we were going through and doing the implementation of this as a demo for the video, got as far as that. Honestly, didn't even go as far as implementing a locale dropdown for it because it was just like, why? At this point, I can't recommend using Next.js Next or really react.js Next for a Next.js app router application for internationalization. It just doesn't fit the patterns, and at least as of this point, it does feel like they've kind of thrown their hands up on this part of the JavaScript application ecosystem. Maybe this will change over time. If it does, and you would like us to do a follow-up video on this subject, we'd be happy to. But right now, can't recommend it. And why do we include this in this video? Well, again, it's a very popular choice, and just want to make sure that we kind of help you avoid some foot guns as you go through your internationalization journey. That said, let's move on. Looking at Next-Intl here, we will of course start with our middleware, and we're going to import our locales, our default locale, etc. From here, it's done according to the documentation constants/config, and we are going to just pass those as properties to the create middleware function, and that's pretty much that. Our dictionary files are going to be imported here in this itn.ts file. Now, you don't actually have to import this file anywhere. You just need to have it be stored here, and the package is going to know to look for it there. If you, on the other hand, want to locate this file anywhere else, you just need to make sure that after you install your boilerplate here that you need to in next.config.js or .mjs in this case, you just pass an additional property here to let the package know where you're going to store that information. And if you'd like to see where that is in the docs, you just jump to the itn.ts file section here, and there's this question here, can I move this file somewhere else? And that's where you find that. Okay, so that's the basic configuration here, and then of course we have our dictionary files as always here, and then we have a file in lib called navigation. This is going to do something kind of nice for us. This is going to set up localized path names, which is pretty cool, because if we now finally look at our config file, we're going to see that we have the elements that we're used to seeing here, our locales, our default path name, etc. But notice that we have this path names object that we're exporting as well. So what's going on here is that we can localize the path names. Now you can of course do this with a CMS. That's another story for another day, but this is pretty nice that directly as part of the application, you can actually say that in English, path names will be path names and Dutch should be Vadnamen. And so pretty cool. All right, moving on here, we are getting down to business with the layout and components. All right, so starting with layout here, we are going to see what we've seen before. We have generate static params. We are not importing our dictionary. We are just going to pass along the locale. Taking a look at the main layout here, as we have previously, are importing our header and footer. Notice that we are not including any sort of a sub layout to make header into a client component. We don't get to the client side of things until a little bit later. And I'm going to skip over what's going on here for just a moment because I want to show you locale switcher where all this ends up happening. So we still don't have a client component. We only have a client component when we drill all the way down to locale switcher select, which is going to do quite a bit more. In this case, to switch from one locale to another, we are actually going to use the instance of the router that we created in our config. This is coming from our libnav file. And when the user changes locale, we're going to use a React transition. We're going to do router replace. We're going to pass everything that it needs. And so that's kind of an interesting approach. So we're in a way relying on some very React primitives, and another way, we're extending the router, and you have to decide if you like that or not. Okay, so then here's the markup for that. All right, now that so far is our one and only client components. That's pretty nice to keep things really tight there. Then here, again, as you're probably used to by now, we have used translations. In this context, we are going to not pass the locale because the application is aware of the locale that it's in. And we are just going to pass the namespace of the keys that we're interested in. We pass those along. Okay. Now, coming back here to header, you'll see something that maybe looks a little bit strange. So what's going on here? Unstable set request locale. So what this relates to is enabling static rendering using Next.Intl. If you want to use static rendering, at least as of the recording of this video, you are going to have to use this unstable set request locale. Now that doesn't seem like an enormous cost to me. It's a bit tedious because it needs to be in every layout and every page so that as you navigate across the application, the properties, the values that are passed into your translation functions are going to reroute according to the namespace that you've chosen, and if you change locales, according to the locale that you've chosen. So just something to keep in mind. There's a lot of details here on this page. If you feel like going into the weeds, they definitely share them. Taking a look at product.tsx, you're going to see a structure here very similar to what we had in the Next-IET Next version. We don't have to pass our dictionary. We do have to pass the locale here to product and to button and anywhere else that we want to use it. We're going to instantiate our translations as we do for all three libraries. And as is the case of the recording of this video, we still have to call this unstable set request locale. So that is going to do it for our review of these three libraries. I have to say, when we sat down to storyboard this video, my expectation with the experience that I had with these packages so far was that I would want to go with Next-Intl. Next International is actually something that popped up during our research, and I'm glad it did, because for me, that's the winner right now. I love the type safety. I love the built-in static generation for client and server. It's flexible for both app and pages router. So if you're in the process of migrating an application from the pages router to the app router, it looks like it has your back. And yeah, it's just simple. You kind of flip the switch and you're ready to go. You have all the features that you would want out of a Next.js application, at least as far as the rudiments of getting it wired up. So my intention is that for the rest of this series, we are going to be using Next International as our go-to as we proceed to expand this application and demonstrate more advanced concepts. Again, as I mentioned last week, we are just now getting to the end of the basics here. Next week, we'll start with what I would call the mid-tier stuff. And it's going to be far beyond just a couple of code snippets and looking at libraries. So you're definitely going to want to stick around for that. If you got value out of this video, drop us a like below, subscribe to make sure you don't miss the rest of this series, and we will see you next time.